Okay, well, thanks, Dave. I'm not sure whether I feel optimistic now. I feel a bit uncertain. And I'm sorry to be taking you away from your television where you might be watching, just to see there might be the odd surprise. I don't know. I doubt it. But so anyway, thanks for inviting me, Dave. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion because, as I say at the beginning of this book, it's not like a manifesto. It's not saying this is what I believe, and I hang it up like sort of Martin Luther or something. It's very much a contribution to the discussion. So it's an unfinished sort of contribution that depends now on other people kind of taking its ideas forward, if the ideas have got any sort of relevance. So my plan is to kind of set out the broad argument and then think about its relevance now. Maybe both sort of its relevance before Brexit, the Brexit sort of phenomena hit, and now maybe its relevance now, just some sort of suggestions. It's very much a contribution around what I've called the politics of knowledge. So I've long been interested in going beyond representative democracy. I suppose as a student in 1968, I felt very disillusioned with, conventional political politics, conventional political systems. This was, people know the 60s. There'd been the Wilson government elected with quite a lot of high hopes. It looks odd to think so now, but if you go back to copies of New Left Review in 1964, people like Tom Nairn and, Perry Anderson, intelligent people were saying, this could be they didn't quite say the dawning of a new age, but it was very, very optimistic. And maybe, younger students like me were infected by that. So there was a kind of sense of hope. But then, the Wilson government became completely subordinate to the financial institutions, the gnomes of Zurich, as they were called, that they completely submitted to. There are lots of arguments I won't go into about devaluation of the pound, but, Labour, Harold Wilson sort of stuck to the importance of the pound. So all this continuing theme of the Labour Party, this kind of allegiance to sort of Great Britain and all its symbolism, even more than the Tories almost. And then the Wilson government became under pressure from the US to be supporting the war in Vietnam. In the end, a huge movement that the student movement was very much part of managed to resist that, and in the end Wilson didn't support LBJ in spite of him, the President of the United States, wanting UK support. But the other feature of the Wilson government was an increasing attack on trade unions, because this was a time when trade unions were very strong, particularly in the workplaces. And the Wilson government was, in a way, the architect of a whole sort of the beginnings of the attack on trade union power, which Thatcher completed. And actually, Tribunite MPs were part of that. Barbara Castle, who, was a kind of key part of Tribune, was the minister who was the architect of this legislation. Anyway, all this led students like me to be very disillusioned and to feel that, Parliament didn't have any real power, that the key decisions were being taken by financial institutions. In a way, quite sort of echoing what's happening now. So we didn't feel that democracy actually existed. And then we were hearing from the United States movements like the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, and they produced an amazing statement called the Port Huron Statement, which I haven't got it with me here, but you can look it up, and it's all about participatory democracy. It's based on a critique of what C. Wright Mills, the great sociologist who was a sort of bit of a guru of that movement, called the military-industrial complex, the sort of alliance of big corporations with military interests. And that, that sort of seemed to make sense to an understanding of Britain. So we were already, talking about participatory democracy, trying to reform our institutions, our colleges, the courses. We developed a whole critique of the course that a lot of us did, politics, philosophy and economics, which was sort of training the future elites, and so we tried to dismantle that. And anyway, and so at the same time there was the movement in Paris, which we felt a direct connection with. So I won't go into the sort of stories from '68 unless you want me to in the discussion. But anyway, from that moment on, participatory democracy and the idea of going beyond parliamentary democracy and how to deepen democracy was really my main sort of purpose in life. Maybe it sounds a bit sad, but that was kind of what I was really interested in. And so I kind of chased it. I mean, my family now joke because they say, there she was chasing radical socialism, participatory democracy, and here it was on her doorstep in Islington. But anyway, I did chase it all around the world. Porto Alegre in Brazil. I don't know, I've got some sort of sore throat from the freezing cold of Glasgow. But anyway, so I looked at participatory democracy mainly actually in the south. It seemed to be much more evident as actual practice in countries like Brazil, particularly, which had been a country that was just coming out of the dictatorship. There was a party which, we probably all know about, the PT, which, was very radical at that time. It kind of got sucked into a rather corrupt machinery of state in the end with Lula, but, was very radical in its origins because it sort of, on the one hand, believed in liberal democracy, the rule of law, against the dictatorship, but on the other hand had seen how weak that parliamentary system was in the face of the dictatorship. So they, were founded in the belief that they needed a more participatory form of democracy. So they tried it at a local level. I don't know whether people have heard of the whole idea of participatory budgets, in the one particular town in the south, Porto Alegre. So there were, anyway, all these experiences. And then in Britain, there were experiences that I got a bit involved in, like workers in a company called Lucas Aerospace that made military equipment. And when they were faced with redundancies, they said, actually, our skills are not redundant. These were some of the most highly skilled engineers and designers in the country, if not in Europe, if not in the world. And they were saying, look, we don't have to be making, missiles. We could be making energy conservation equipment, medical equipment, alternative transport equipment, and, because they had a great confidence in their own capacities. So when they were faced with redundancies, this was under a Labour government with Tony Benn and the Department of Industry. They went to see Tony Benn and he said, well, do you want me to nationalise? He was a very different kind of minister from Harold Wilson and most of the traditional ministers. And he looked to the workers for sort of answers, and he said, do you want me to nationalise the aerospace components industry? And they said, well, actually, we don't think that's enough. I mean, they were workers from the Northwest, from all parts of the country, who'd experienced, the mines and experienced the railways and seen that actually pure, simple nationalisation, simple state control didn't solve the problem. There were still redundancies, rationalisations. There wasn't a real shift in power. So they said, no, that's not enough. We need to develop our own plans for the future of industry, and then nationalisation can be a tool. So they had confidence not only, these were the shop stewards, not only in their own capacities, but in those of their members. So they said, well, firstly, they sent a letter to academics saying, if you've got any ideas about what we could be producing. And they got about 3 replies. And then they looked to their members and started a discussion in their factories and design offices. And this, again, going back to what I said earlier about the strength of the shop stewards movement, this was a time when the shop stewards movement, this was in the late 70s, when it was still very strong. It was beginning to be hit by rationalisations and companies trying to be competitive, so cutting labour as their first cost-cutting measure. So they were beginning to be hit by that process, but they were still strong enough to say, actually, we can resist these redundancies, not just by occupations and so on, but with alternatives, with our own vision. So they involved their members in discussions, and they came up with 150 alternatives, really practical alternatives. But what they did was not just write those up, but they were designers, and they felt their skill, their knowledge was in their actual production of alternatives. So they did prototypes, and they would talk about their tacit knowledge, which I'll be coming back to in this process. And then I got very involved in the women's movement, which again had a very distinct understanding of knowledge. You know, it was a movement that didn't just organise demonstrations or public meetings. It had what we called consciousness-raising groups, where I mean, I'm looking at other grey-haired people, and I think there are probably others that were involved in those consciousness-raising groups, where you met and in a way shared what people might dismiss as not as gossip, kind of like, you know, discussion about what's happening to your life, to your body, to your relationships. But out of this practical and tacit knowledge came all sorts of ideas about improving the health service and the relationship between the doctor and women. It led to centres for battered women, to well women clinics, all kinds of ideas about improving the quality of life for women, and based on their knowledge of what was needed. Anyway, all this is a bit of an introduction to say that led me to think, well, we need to go beyond simply talking about new structures and participatory democracy, that in the end, if we look at what happened in a lot of these cases, like Brazil, those experiments got kind of blocked or wound down because there was some limit to the nature of politics, to the nature of political parties and the mentality of political leaderships. So I felt, well, actually we've got to go deeper and look at what are the conditions under which participatory democracy can be realised. What are the deeper sort of structural, ideological and political blocks to it being a kind of system of economic and political government? And that led me to this idea of looking at what kinds of knowledge underpin, or presumptions about knowledge underpin the existing system, and what kind of alternative ideas about knowledge are emerging from the sort of movements and experiments and resistance that I've just summarised. So that led me to kind of long history of the whole 1945 Labour government, you know, the sort of climax of Labourism and, you know, what everybody is sort of saying we should be going back to. I mean, I don't know if many of you saw Ken Loach's film, The Spirit of 45, which captured some of this, but also captured some of its limits. And I thought, well, let's look at how the architects of that government, that post-war settlement, which has been so fundamental to the thinking of both the left and the right, and what were their sort of presumptions. And so that led me to Beatrice and Sidney Webb, who were the intellectual sort of architects of basically Labour's policies. I mean, they were getting on by then. I think they didn't. I think Beatrice Webb died during that government, but intellectually they were kind of they wrote the Labour Party's constitution. They sort of formed its framework. And I read her diaries, which are pretty impressive. You can get them online. But there was one time when she said very revealingly, do you need a chat? Sorry. She said very revealingly, she said, we, meaning her husband and other Fabian thinkers, have little faith in the average sensual man. As she described ordinary people. We do not believe that he can do much more than describe his grievances. We do not think he can prescribe his remedies. We wish to introduce the professional expert, i.e. their understanding of knowledge of the Labour Party's membership was that basically the masses, the mass of working class people, can sort of cry out in pain, but they don't have the capacity, the knowledge to develop alternatives. For that, you needed the Fabians, or you needed professionals, experts in that sort of narrow sense. And then I read a similar quote from, this is all in the book, so I won't go on, but from from Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who obviously, you know, is very good in lots of respects. But his presumptions about knowledge are incredibly sort of elitist, if you like. I mean, I'll go into more depth about what I mean by that. He said, what's the real repulsion that keeps me away from the Labour Party? Because he wasn't in the Labour Party, even though he was a key advisor to Labour governments, or the Labour government in 45. There are differences between the several parties in the degree to which the party machine is democratised through and through, and the preparation of the party programme democratised in its details. In this respect, the Conservative Party is in the best position. And by best, he said, the inner ring of the party can almost dictate the details and the technique of policy. Traditionally, the management of the Labour Party was also sufficiently autocratic. And then he complained about recent pressures to democratise it. The Labour Party, on the other hand, is in a far weaker position. I do not believe that the intellectual elements in the party will ever exercise adequate control. Too much will always be decided by those who do not know at all what they're talking about, and that was his emphasis. So again, you know, the most influential intellectual of his time politically had no belief in the capacities of ordinary people. And here I'm not trying to deny the importance and distinctiveness of what could be called scientific knowledge, in the sense of scientific laws that can be centralized and codified. And in a way, that idea of centralized and codified laws is the basis of the idea of the state as the planner, the state as the one with the overview. But what I'm saying is that that kind of knowledge isn't adequate. It's not the whole of knowledge. That there's a dimension of knowledge which another theorist of science, Michael Polanyi, has said it's tacit knowledge. And actually, he doesn't counterpose that to, you know, what's traditionally understood as scientific knowledge. His book, The Tacit Dimension, is really all about how actually the production of science involves all kinds of tacit forms of knowledge. You know, hunches, intuition, ideas gathered, you know, in the course of daily life. You know, I mean, you could even look at the origin of the theory of gravity. You know, Isaac Newton was just watching an apple fall, just like a hunch, an intuition. So, in a way, he was analysing that tacit dimension and the kind of traditions of elite planning and sort of elite expertise deny that sort of practical knowledge, which is really what, you know, the women's movement, the shop stewards movement was all about. And then I got involved with, I mean, just to go back to then the importance of this, is I got involved a bit with the movements in Eastern Europe, fighting or resisting, you know, the sort of command economy, the movements in Czechoslovakia particularly. And I went to Wenceslas Square and was involved in a movement that was trying to link together the movements in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And I went to see people who'd been involved in Wenceslas Square, the big demonstrations against the old regime, in sort of Stalinist regime in Czechoslovakia. And I greeted them and so on. And they were, I thought their posters were a bit odd. There was like Mick Jagger, okay. And then there was Reagan. I thought, this is a bit odd. They were dressed in the same way as sort of hippies, 68 sort of activists. But I thought, you know, they'd be pleased to see me because I was from the social movements in the West. But actually, they were pleased to see me because I came from Mrs. Thatcher's country. So they were completely on the other side of the fence as far as politics is concerned. So I worried about this because, you know, in many ways they were allies. We both believed in democracy. So I interviewed a guy who was actually Minister for Privatisation, but he happened to translate Hayek, who was their kind of guru. And I then went and read Hayek. And it was fascinating because he had a whole theory of knowledge in which he talks about the importance of tacit knowledge. He quotes Polanyi, actually. But his theory was basically this tacit knowledge, another essay on individualism, and the two together basically saying that this tacit knowledge, this practical knowledge, this experiential knowledge, it is individual. It's kind of constitutionally individual. And that the only way you get any kind of social order, therefore, is through the mechanisms of the market that are sort of haphazard in their means of coordination, but lead to a sort of spontaneous order. So I thought, well, tacit knowledge, I've heard that. I heard it with the shop stewards. I can sort of envisage it in the women's movement. But what was characteristic of those movements was that they actually were about the socializing of tacit knowledge, the sharing of tacit knowledge. So whereas Hayek used that idea of tacit knowledge to break any connection between intention and outcome, so any possibility of planning, of coordination, of regulation of the market, you know, armed with a theory of the socialization of tacit knowledge, we could say actually we can link intention with outcome, not in a completely predictive way, so not the same as the sort of positivistic scientists and social scientists of the Webbs and the traditional sort of notions of science, but we can connect it in a sort of more or less in an experimental kind of way. There's always an element of doubt. There's always an element of experimentation. Anyway, so I felt, without being pretentious, that this was the basis of a new theory of knowledge and a new politics of knowledge. And so that's what I was wanting to explore in this book. And I was sort of inspired practically by not surprisingly, by Jeremy Corbyn. And because it seemed to me that he was a different kind of left leader. And he wasn't, people talk about him being populist, but I don't think he was populist in the sense that most populist leaders are saying, come to me, you know, I'm going to solve your problems. I represent what you believe in. You know, the idea of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe of the populist leader as the sort of signifier of the desires of the people. Corbyn, on the contrary, in a way, was trying to build confidence and self-confidence and collective organisation, stimulate it amongst the people. So he was almost like pushing power back. So we did an interview with him for Red Pepper, and he said, as if explaining this approach, this idea of encouraging people to have confidence in themselves, which was also a feature in a slightly more paternalistic way of Tony Benn. And he said, in describing his personal attitude to expertise, he said, I never held in awe those who've had higher education, nor, he said, do I have a sense of superiority over those who don't. Life is life. Some of the wisest people you meet are sweeping our streets. And he gave an example of a friend of his who was a street sweeper, but who was incredibly aware and knowledgeable of the sources and implications of climate change, and who lived in this rigorously ecological kind of way, expressing a kind of practical knowledge in the solutions to climate change. Anyway, so this I felt was sort of why I felt it was right that Jeremy talked about a new politics. I felt it was actually this idea of a different understanding of knowledge and therefore a different understanding of the relationship to the people. And that, you know, obviously there's been lots of ups and downs and developments in the Corbyn sort of project. But I think I was encouraged when John McDonnell came out very clearly with a vision of public industries. You know, they made a very big and important and successful plan for bringing all the utilities back into public ownership. But he's made it very clear that that must be a completely different kind of public ownership. You know, the kind of public ownership that you had in 1945, inspired, if you like, by the Webb's idea of the expert being dominant and ordinary people not having a clue, was an idea, you know, that the managers of the coal board, of the railways and so on, must be the old managers who were the experts, or maybe a few retired generals and admirals who knew how to command. And the workers who'd actually done a lot of work, the miners and the railway workers had done a lot of work preparing, you know, plans for workers' control. That was completely out of the window. And as the flag of the coal board was raised. I think this was in Ken Loach's film, was raised to celebrate public ownership. It was the old managers and these generals that went into the board meetings, and the workers were completely excluded, i.e. there was no shift in power. And so, you know, that gave me the hope that we were seeing a new politics develop through the present Labour Party. I think there are lots of issues to discuss about what that would mean for the organisation of the party, and I don't think that's been fully taken on board, because although the party's become a very mobilising party, I realise the question of the Labour Party isn't so relevant here, but we can discuss that, because I think any party that claims to be of a radical transformative character needs to have a politics that acknowledges and helps to develop the capacity of the people. And that so there's a recognition of the importance of mobilisation and street action and so on, but not of the importance of helping groups actually get organised themselves and develop their own capacities, which would then be supported by a left government, whether it's SNP or whatever, or Labour Party. Anyway, that's something to discuss, what forms that should take. So now, then came Brexit. So just to sort of try and update my arguments, maybe rather controversially, because I haven't thought it through. I mean, it seems now you've got a situation where the whole issue of democracy, the will of the people, is like the new terrain that May claims to be, you know, fulfilling the will of the people, and Corbyn is saying, you know, he's not prepared to betray the will of the people. So somehow you could say, well, democracy is back at the centre. But is it democracy? What kind of democracy are we talking about? I mean, to me, you know, actually the arguments about democracy have now been kind of completely blocked by a totally distorting idea, because in a way we've got to go back to the origins of the referendum that is supposedly, you know, the source of this democratic will. And unlike the referendum in Scotland, which I really support, well, I supported independence. I'm not Scottish, but I felt it was important for democracy in England and in the whole the UK. I felt the breakup of Britain was important, and I felt the independence referendum was a much more genuinely democratic process now, looking back and comparing it, because it came out of a movement that was for independence, and that was a very considered movement that had been the result of a lot of discussions, a lot of ideas, a lot of, you know, sharing of knowledge. Whereas the referendum about Brexit, you know, if you think back and you remember the man who's now hiding in his shepherd's hut, David Cameron, you know, he called that referendum purely for party purposes, purely to kind of outflank UKIP. So that was a referendum called not to have a real discussion, a real sharing of knowledge about the UK's relationship to Europe, which would mean also the UK itself and its own institutions and its own democracy. It was a referendum called purely on UKIP's terms. So it was about, you know, it was about Europe, this big bureaucracy is the problem. Immigrants, you know, are the problem. You know, so it was an entirely false kind of agenda. And so somehow we've got to, I think we've got to confront that and therefore slightly dethrone this idea of that referendum representing a truly democratic process. But we've then got to think how we bring democracy back, how we reclaim what was emerging in a way, in the success of Corbyn. I felt that was an expression of people's yearning for a different political system and responding to a politician who all the establishment was saying, you know, he's no good, he's not a proper leader, he doesn't sing the national anthem, you know. And in fact, every time they attacked him, the more popular he became, because actually the majority of people, you know, don't want to defer to the Queen. I mean, I'm not saying they're all Republicans, but, you know, there's a sort of feeling that there was a feeling that actually people, you know, had a kind of capacity of their own and that they wanted a leader who would support them. So we've got to reclaim that, and I think neither a people's vote nor an election is adequate, that we need both, but then within that we need parties, whether it's, you know, the Labour Party or the SNP or the Greens, who, you know, come forward with a plan, a real plan, or not just a plan, a process of democratisation of our nations, democratisation of local government, democratisation of the economy. I mean, a lot of interesting ideas are being developed at a local level, but they're not going to get far without some kind of constitutional change. So I probably better end there because I want lots of discussion. And I think I've got formally 10 more minutes, but I'd rather hand that over to you. So I'll end there, really. I hope I've summarised what I mean by a politics of knowledge. And so my question is really, if you do ask me questions to clarify that understanding of a new politics of knowledge, and then think through what would that mean institutionally, by what means. I mean, for me, the whole democratisation of the economy is as important as the democratisation of our political institutions, but I think the two have got to go hand in hand. You can't have constitutional reform in abstract. It's got to be of a kind that has built the power to confront transnational corporations, and that's why I feel some kind of transnational institution is necessary. But those political institutions have got to be backed by forces in production, you know, in the economy. There's got to be a material base. That's why the right does so well, because it has, you know, an existing material base. It has capitalist production, capitalist markets. We can't create socialism sort of within capitalism, but we can create a lot of, you know, collective forms, commons forms, democratic forms that can be crucial in backing political institutions that confront economic oligarchy and economic power. So I'll end with those sort of questions and hope you give the answers. Thanks. And so please don't just ask questions, do you know, challenge me and make contributions too.
So, maybe ask away. Questions and thoughts. David?
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed that. I guess I wanted to ask or talk specifically around the question of labour and self-organisation. So I should say I'm coming from the perspective of someone who joined after Corbyn became leader. I was in Islington at that time, but I'm now here. And for me, there has been some quite encouraging ways in which they're starting to think about that, not just in terms of, I suppose, democratising the economy in terms of public ownership, but things like, one of the things I was quite pleased to see at the last conference was talk about giving grants towards renters' unions in Britain. And for me, it kind of went, and strangely, I was reading the other day stuff to do with the GLC in the 80s about John McDonnell being on the grants subcommittee and, you know, giving out money to other organisations in London. And in a sense, it went back to that, the idea that you give money, you take, you know, use your state power to get those resources and give them to other organisations. In a way, it's a bit shallow. I think what has been a bit disappointing in terms of actually giving power to, say, renters' unions. That, you know, there could be an approach where you give renters' unions kind of comparable power to, say, trade unions, you know, statutory rights and so on, which has been a bit shadowed on. But there is that element. And the other element I think you can see in which the Labour Party is trying to do that is through the community organisers. And I don't know if you've come across the kind of community organising approach. I mean, to me, it's kind of a good, in theory, and I think practice has been a lot poorer than it potentially could have been, partly because it's actually being organised, from my experience, still very much around electoral organising. If we do community organising, this will help us get elected at the next general election, rather than we need to build power both in Parliament and outside Parliament. I suppose that's part of the contribution, but also the question is whether you've, I suppose, come across that kind of community organising, that sort of thing, and whether you think that's part of what Labour could be doing or is doing around that kind of broader promoting self-organisation.
Yeah, no, that's good. What shall I do? Shall I take a few or just reply?
Just respond.
Okay. No, so I agree with both. Well, I agree with your first point that the whole idea of taking office in order not then to sort of presume that you, the party with the civil servants, can deliver the answers, but rather to use that, the power you have through gaining office, to redistribute funds and power and platform to organisations in society that have a much greater power, you know, in the long run to bring about change, because they're the people on whom the existing system depends, you know, whether it's renters, you know, if they're quiescent and passive and complicit with the existing system, it's going to take it much more, it's going to be much more difficult to reform it. So that is, I mean, I worked briefly at the GLC. We had a unit which we optimistically called the Popular Planning Unit. I remember I had a colleague who was something, because we'd always answer the phone saying, "Hello, this is the Popular Planning Unit," and he would sometimes answer the phone saying, "Hello, this is the miserable planning unit." Anyway, we were very optimistic and hopeful because we had huge resources, you know, millions, and so we used those resources partly to give out grants. So there was another group that gave out grants, and we gave out grants in our case to organisations that were not only resisting but actually developing alternatives. So a classic case was in the Royal Docks, which was, is a prime site in London, and that whole area had been taken over by a company, the London Docklands Development Corporation, under Thatcher's diktat, to create companies that would take away all the powers of local government, all the planning powers and democratic powers, and then allow companies to invest, take over the land. So a key project of the London Docklands Development Corporation was an airport called a stall port, because it was meant to be short takeoff and landing jets. Anyway, the people were up in arms, most of them, not all, because some felt there'd be something in it for them, but the majority were really angry. And so we, in the Popular Planning Unit, we thought, well, okay, where there's resistance, people have got some vision of an alternative, even if it's not explicit. So we went down there, talked to the people, attended their meetings, and, you know, we didn't come with our plan. We said, okay, so how can we help you? Your resistance to the airport is in line with the electoral mandate of the GLC, which was to maintain that area as some kind of more European port linking to a sort of public railway hub. You know, it was accepting the old imperial Port of London was over, but there could be some more European-oriented port system. So we had the framework agreed in the manifesto, and that had an electoral legitimacy, but we didn't know the detail, and we in a way have this intuitive belief in the knowledge of the people. So they said, well, you know, we're all busy, we've got our daily lives, so we can't develop a plan ourselves. But if we had a people's plan centre or somewhere, they use that phrase, but somewhere where people could come with their ideas, and maybe we could employ local people to stimulate people's ideas. So we gave a grant to the setting up of a People's Plan Centre, which they set up, and then they, you know, I think maybe I was on the committee from the Popular Planning Unit, and we then employed local people, a school girl, woman, a local businessman, small businessman in the docks, a mother whose main preoccupation was looking after her kids, and I think somebody else, a pensioner. Anyway, and they would go around to bingo sessions and get people talking about their ideas, or they'd go around talking to the different small businesses, seeing how they could, you know, collaborate to develop a bit of an economy around the docks. And we developed this People's Plan for the Royal Docks. And that did build the campaign. We didn't win because of Thatcher, really, and the LDDC, and there was an inquiry into the airport, and we won a few concessions, but it's gone ahead, and you know. But that's just an example of how, you know, you can use electoral power to support a deeper kind of democratization. It's not an alternative to electoral power and representative democracy, but it deepens the efficacy of that. So Yeah, I mean, I think, say, with the Renters' Union, that would be a classic example of supporting them, and then hopefully, that's my alarm. Supporting them, hopefully then listening to them about what should be done about rent control and housing policy. And then, yeah, the community organising. From what I know, I think that probably is a problem, that the focus is on bringing people to the Labour Party rather than on, in a way, spreading resources to help people get organised, which is what I would advocate. I mean, I've not got involved in this discussion with the community unit, but I think that should be the emphasis. Well, following from my argument, but maybe that'll happen. I mean, I think these things have a dynamic, although I think all dynamics have been rather closed down at the moment.
Hilary, thank you for all that. I was around with you in Newcastle in the 70s when Beyond the Fragments was written and published, and it became a bit of a Bible for many of us. And some of us call ourselves fraggies. I'm interested to know if and how and in what way your views have changed, developed. What are the key ways in which your views, your strategies have developed since that moment? Maybe they haven't, and maybe everything you believe now is encapsulated in that, but I'm surprised if that would be the case.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, I mean, the Beyond the Fragments was, just for other people who weren't around then, it was really taking the experience of the women. It's called Beyond the Fragments, Feminism and the Making of Socialism. And it was based on the idea that we were seeing in it would be the mid-70s really, more and more developments locally particularly, but they were outside the Labour Party, but yet they were quite sort of systemic in their visions, you know, whether it was the women's movement or I remember tenants groups in Newcastle or even shop stewards organisations. They were political. They weren't just, you couldn't dismiss them as many people did as like single issue campaigns, i.e., you know, single issue implies, you know, people have got a particular set of demands or concern which the party as the kind of organisation with the wider vision can take on board. So they're reduced to being like pressure groups on a wider political party. And we were saying, well, actually, no, these groups, these movements have got a sort of tacit and implicit sort of vision. They're a politics. And that, is there a way of, by learning from the more networked forms of organisation of the women's movement, that these could sort of federate and come together? I mean, one sense, you know, in our favour, you could say we were quite advanced. We were sort of networking pre-internet, pre-ICT, you know, information communications technology. We had that notion of horizontal ways of organising before the tools, the technological tools for that to be possible were realised. But I think we were probably a bit too optimistic about the possibility of bringing people together and creating a movement without some sort of political expression. And I suppose I could say that's what I learnt. I learnt it a bit through the GLC, so that there, in a way, the sort of coherence of any movement in London was stimulated by the fact there was a supportive political body that didn't actually lead to everybody coming together, but did lead to greater sort of political cohesion amongst groups who fought together to defend the GLC, who collaborated to get funds and support from the GLC. And I suppose then, I mean, I have actually, I confess, joined the Labour Party, which, you know, in the days of Beyond the Fragments, I would not have done. And indeed, even after the GLC, I wrote a book called Labour, A Tale of Two Parties, which was very much following the Ralph Miliband argument that you cannot turn the Labour Party into a socialist party. And I mean, that's still a question, because though Corbyn's been elected as leader, that doesn't mean the Labour Party is a socialist party. And there's a lot that needs to change. So in a way, I'm a little bit ambiguous about that. But I think the question of representative democracy and some political expression is something if I was rewriting Beyond the Fragments. I think we did do a second edition. And I think one thing we said, at least I said, was that we didn't realise in a way that the forces of the right were sort of growing as we were optimistically, building our movements and organising Beyond the Fragments conferences. So, actually that was the time that financialisation was growing, that corporate power was growing, all the economic forces that provided the basis for Thatcherism were kind of growing behind our back. And so, in a way, maybe we didn't fully realise how far you need governmental power to sort of block and confront those forces to create the space for all the sort of alternatives that we were talking about. So, I mean, it's a good question, and that's kind of attempt at an answer. But maybe we can talk after about that.
I suppose it's related to what you were touching on just at the end there. I'm just wondering if we are trying to build like a new politics that involves tacit knowledge and direct participation. What are your thoughts on how we negotiate the boundary between pre-existing so-called legitimate institutions like the party or trade unions or other well-established groups and new self-made organisations if they're needed, which they probably would be, with a sort of expectation or understanding that there will be a limit to what can be achieved within pre-existing state organisations or non-state organisations. And when we reach that limit, where will we go? What would be the next step?
No, that's a really good question. I haven't got a sort of pat answer to that. I mean, I think I'm not sure the right word is negotiate the boundaries. I think that's a good way of sort of maybe as an analytic framework, but in reality, it's a more active, dynamic relationship. So I'm thinking, as an example to dwell on, the way in which, and this illustrates the way in which actual, needs, people's actual needs and people's attempts to meet those needs kind of shaped that relationship. So you've got, not just in London, I think across the country, across the three nations, you've got workers, precarious workers, like in McDonald's or Wetherspoons, facing, 0-hour contracts, insecure work. And the unions, traditionally, are not there. But those workers have got organised, and they've been supported by the Bakers Union, which I suppose has got a connection because it's to do with food. And so there you've got a dynamic which is like a group of workers. I think they were then first supported by a more political, unofficial, sort of more libertarian, anarchist-inspired union. I'm not quite sure that was the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, or UV, I can't remember their names. United Voices. Yes. Okay. Yes. So that group, the Workers of the World, that would be like a stimulus. They'd be probably precarious workers, but with an older political formation, but with a kind of eagerness to do something new. Recognition that you needed to build solidarity and collectivity before anything else could be done. And then you had the Bakers Union that had people in it who recognised that. Exactly where they, what explains their sensitivity, I'm not sure. But anyway, so that was a relationship, if you like, a move beyond the boundaries of the old, stimulated by the creativity and militancy of the new. And that's now spread. So that's an example how if there's a dynamic that's rooted in people's needs, and if there's a sort of catalyst like the workers of the world, then there's a dynamic which can either connect with, within the old. The old is always, as an organisation, is always uneven. So within the old, there might be people who perhaps been influenced by 68, or traditions. After all, traditions are about historical continuity, and there are historical continuities that kind of lie buried but can be stimulated. I mean, in a way, Corbyn and John McDonnell. John McDonnell's now very influenced by his GLC experience, as you implied, and that's like a memory. Memories can be reactivated. So that's a factor in opening up the old in response to some, initiative by the new. And the limits, I don't think there are abstract limits. I think the limits will be to do with the, what are the forces predominant in the old. So let's say the Parliamentary Party, Labour Party, the forces there are like predominantly conservative. They're mainly people who believe that they have a superior position, that they've been elected to make judgments. They're not really delegates of the people. So they have quite a strong sense of their own importance. They make an oath to the Queen, not to the people, which, is symbolic, but it's significant. So where an institution has got vested interests in its, reproduction as conservative and as upholding the status quo, then you'll come up against the limit. And then in the face of that, you have to create new channels. You could say that's kind of what this community organising is doing. So you need new kinds of leadership that are going to grasp those limits and take, moves in a new direction. I don't know if that helps. I'm not sure there's an absolute formula, but unless other people can help here.
I think all these puzzles in my head are connected. Just when you were talking, thinking about, I think we probably got rather similar chronology. That process, how participating democracy so goes against the grain of so much of society, from schooling onwards. And that, when you were saying about the parliamentary party see themselves as experts, but it's not just that they see themselves as experts, but that is placed upon them by their constituents. That if you think of the discourse that we're getting now, it's all about why doesn't Parliament sort this out? The discourse isn't about let us in here because we can sort it out and we know what to do. In fact, I don't know, most of us are saying, what do you want to do? Anyway, I'm just something. So how hard that is, and therefore thinking about the politics of trying to work with communities and think about how you have campaigns and so on, and the tension between wanting it to be socialist, wanting it to be about power, but the content of the struggle might not match that. And I think about, I've been in lots of big meetings in my life, but thinking of ones where, they're not all people that think like me. I can think of one in the 70s in Birmingham at the school because we really needed crossing patrol, and there were just, the school hall had never been so packed. That's what brought them out. It didn't seem to be about politics. Another one was about Stoke Newington, where the MP was there, Diane Abbott was there, so were all the councillors about, guess what? Parking. I'd never seen such a big political meeting Histon Newington, you know. And those sorts of things are really hard, and then you go in and you've got some notions of the politics of it, and is that interism? Is that, you know, some kind of political front that you're operating or whatever? And I think this links to what you said about the EU referendum. Because you contrasted, I'd like you to talk a bit more about that, contrasted the Scottish one with the European one, saying there was something organic about the Scottish one. It came from a movement, ideas and so on, but the other one was imposed because of political pressure. And I'm not sure I agree with that when I think about the campaign, when I think about the growth of UKIP and the intensity of people's feelings, anti-EU feelings. I mean, I think the left ignored that for so long, all those issues that we're bringing out. So, what, you know, if it was not really organic, how come we got so many people actually voting? So when you're working with people and dealing with I don't know if that's about tacit knowledge, or you're going to think about that, that's really an interesting idea. The knowledge isn't always what you want to hear. Is that what I'm trying to say? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're engaging with oppositional ideas some of the time, perhaps. And that's really hard to work with.
Yeah. Okay, no, well, those are good points, and now my response is a bit fragmented too. So one thing I'd say is yes, I mean, those examples, the Birmingham case and the Stoke Newington case, I'd say are examples of expressions of practical knowledge, of people identifying problems, which seem, you know, really legitimate daily life problems. You know, you need to protect your kids against traffic, and you know, car parking. I don't know what the issue there was, but presumably it was against, or was it for the car park?
Because they introduced right here residence parking, but they'd done it democratically, and they had asked everybody in the streets around what they thought. And 5 streets apparently said they didn't want it, so they didn't get residence parking. That meant everybody parked on our street. Right. I mean, people couldn't actually get their cars out, or actually, yeah.
Yes, okay, so maybe there could have been more discussion and negotiation there, because I suppose once you recognise the importance of tacit knowledge, then you recognise the importance of debate and argument. Because, I mean, I think you've got to, the only way of, as it were, developing a politics is by argument and debate. And that, I mean, you're right about the left not addressing some of the issues that UKIP addressed in terms of Europe, in terms of immigration, not sort of creating the framework for a debate in which those arguments and that I mean, knowledge. There's a very good quote from Milton in his Areopagitica, where he says that where there are many opinions, where there is argument, there is the making of knowledge. And I think, you know, in a way, if you see knowledge as only about expert and scientific knowledge, then you restrict debate to simply either Parliament or to the universities or to where that expert knowledge is being concentrated. Whereas if you recognise that actually knowledge is tacit and practical and experiential, then you recognise the importance of a political culture in which debate and argument is like through and through, including time for debate and argument. So all the issues of a shorter working week and a different work conditions that enable people to develop their knowledge, develop their skills, is important. So, I mean, I think my response to like the crossing would be, you know, there would be political issues there, because what, you know, why is the crossing being blocked? You know, I mean, you know, are the needs of children being put first, or are there sort of, you know, more traffic oriented, therefore more car oriented, less social considerations being put first? So those you know, in an argument, a discussion, those could be brought out. And I think with the UKIP and the versus the referendum, the Euro referendum and the Scottish referendum, I mean, my memory is a bit unclear about the Scottish one, but from what I remember, there was a real debate, there was argument that there was, you know, a lot of people, I mean, I'd have thought one reason for the dynamic of the SNP away from purely sort of tartan Tories is because, you know, the movement for independence became a movement for democracy, a movement against Westminster, a sort of left movement in a way, from what I observed. I mean, not maybe entirely, but and that was a product of a movement that was full of debate and discussion and political organisations and civic organisations engaging in a sort of quite systemic, you know, what kind of society do we want? So that reactionary ideas were challenged, you know, whereas I think, I don't know enough about the areas in the north where UKIP was strong, but I mean, I think it's very clear from there's a very good article by Tom Hazeldine in New Left Review that, you know, the UKIP vote in the north and the Brett Leave vote in the north was very much to do with the responses to inequality, to abandonment, deindustrialization, and the sort of continuing abandonment, not by only Thatcher, but by Blair, you know, and a feeling that here people had a moment to scream, you know, to sort of actually shout, but it wasn't. I'm not saying they were wrong to take that opportunity, but it isn't like a sort of expression of democracy, because in a way then you had UKIP and the media sort of exploiting that discontent in a way that was packed with lies and, you know, and the Labour Party didn't create a framework of debate. You know, partly that Remain campaign was very, you know, it was a cross-party one, and people like Jeremy Corbyn were excluded from it. You know, they weren't allowed to talk, to be part of it, really. So that there was never a political leadership that created a debate in which new knowledge could be produced. So, I mean, I'm agreeing with you that a lot of these forms of resistance can begin from quite apolitical or seemingly apolitical causes, but I feel actually when you listen to those debates and you get involved, there's a political logic that can be brought out.
I didn't think it was apolitical. I thought it was that some of the politics was not what I believed in. You see what I mean?
No, you mean the
Well, I suppose I got two things mixed up. One was to do with what brings people in who are not rather politically inclined anyway, outside the workplace, in the community. But then the other one is about some of the things you hear, and when you're involved in that, you don't. So I'm not saying, of course, that is an opportunity then for, you know, like fewer cars.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of leads to a place where I think that the last 10 years have been pretty definitive under austerity, and I feel there's an extent to which we are looking at, you know, political is becoming local, but power is global, and, you know, there's an importance to realise that kind of often the political structures have now been co-opted and to ensure that they don't challenge the key elements of power. You know, the fact that we went through those years of the Labour government and we've still got an elected second house, and all these kind of absolutely basic inequalities, which still don't seem to be, you know, challenged in a meaningful sense. You just listen to the Labour spokesperson being interviewed after the vote yesterday and talking about freedom of movement and things, and nobody's saying it's not, the migration isn't the problem, and actually it's the kind of the economic situation. Basic things like saying capitalism and democracy are incompatible, you know, and there's such an opportunity and a need at the moment to be much more explicit in taking on the very fundamental toxic nature of capitalism. and the context we find ourselves in. But I was listening to a programme recently about Hannah Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism, and thinking about the kind of banality of evil, this kind of idea as a kind of fungus. And I think that we need to be making the argument much more loudly and explicitly that the last 10 years have been a crime against humanity. And things like the universal credit and these kind of elements are things that which just should not be tolerated in any kind of, any kind of human or rights respecting society. And there's, we live in a far right country, and we're worried, of course, because we're seeing Orban and we're seeing all these other ways being in extreme right. But there seems to be this creeping or allowing the debate to shift so far to the right that we still allow, when the articles always call Jeremy Corbyn a left winger. I never talked to Theresa May about the extreme right wing person. So constantly, I don't feel that there is an articulate voice on the left, which even in the cracks, even in the opportunities they have to speak, have a coherent message. The nearest we got was the UN spokesperson saying if you took a load of misogynists and sat them down in the room, they could come up with a more anti-female policy in the welfare reforms. But that just seems to kind of be allowed to drift in the wind. We've talked about hope, talked about ideas. I know that the papers talk a lot about a fearless cities movement, radical municipalism, and it seems to be that we have to be much more aware of these kind of rethinking of politics, policies, the people that we're getting involved, and the purpose we have in terms of why, what our activism is about. And it's frustrating to feel that there are clear opportunities for the left which just do not seem to be used at all, even with Corbyn, who I've got a lot of time for, but he's still obviously fighting the right within his own party, let alone fight the Tories.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you broadly. I mean, I think he is doing his best. I mean, but he doesn't obviously benefit from a supportive press. And I think the party itself maybe, I think also he's caught in this dilemma of, does he just go for winning the election, or does he, do more to recreate the party, to build community organising that's reaching out rather than bringing people in. And I think that is a difficult one, because on the one hand, we all want him to win. So we recognise the importance of the electoral struggle. But on the other hand, the electoral struggle can be very powerful at sort of sucking people in. I mean, I looked a bit at the situation in Greece, and there's quite a lesson, because at a key moment in the development of Syriza, the party that won the election, and has got many, well, it's very different from the Labour Party, because it was like an alternative party, but it was founded out of social movements, and then as it became grew to get nearer to electoral office and win the election, and it was going up in the polls, the leadership and the party just kind of closed down into a purely electoral machine, and all the links with the solidarity movements and the solidarity economy were sort of closed down, and it became an electoral machine, which then weakened its ability to resist the troika. And I think that's a possible danger with Corbyn and the Labour Party, that it's so focused on the electoral side, which is kind of a product of our parliamentary system. And I suppose my idea of a way out is for Corbyn to be a bit more radical about constitutional change, to take up, to support Scottish independence, to talk more about a federal Britain, to talk about proportional representation, to talk about powers for local government. and therefore to sort of challenge the parliamentary system, at the same time as, carrying on fighting to be elected, but with a more, in some ways, more radical program. I mean, these are ideas that they support. I don't think he supports proportional representation, but John McDonnell does, and I think the independence thing is sort of, Jeremy Corbyn doesn't support Scottish independence, but there's quite a move in the party towards the idea of a federal UK. So these ideas are there, but there needs to be more, more willingness to take a risk and sort of actually make the development of ideas and a more radical kind of community organising, more prevalent. I mean, it's not as if, they're doing very well in the opinion polls as it is through their sort of cautious strategy. So I don't think they're going to lose much by a more radical approach. But I mean, I don't want to pontificate about what they should do, because I'm not kind of like part of those inner circles. And, I think it must be very difficult when you are, and, you're constantly under, attack from the press. And so you're sort of forced into a defensive mode. But, we should just do whatever we can.
But I'm just interested, because it couldn't be more incompetent, the Tory government, if you tried. If you look down south, what they've done to education, what they've done to the health, it's like, how can you not score in these open goals time and time and time again? And that's what I find kind of, struggle to believe. And that's why I think, at the end of the day, we need to be trying to plan and mobilise for a different type of politics, and we need to be working from a grassroots level up. But we can't ignore the violence and the injustices that are being visited by the system at the moment. But I genuinely find it difficult to understand why these people who are putting themselves up to speed interest in politics seem to be incapable of putting a coherent argument of the left forward, even to an sympathetic place, because at least if the argument's there and the press doesn't report it true enough, the argument doesn't even seem to be made, apart from in kind of the New Internationalist paper these days. And people like the Transnational Institute, those kind of organisations. But it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree, it's frustrating. But I think the best, we can just do what we can in wherever we are. We can't, I'm not sure how much point there is in sort of berating, the existing politicians that are kind of, I feel the left politicians are doing their best. They do, Corbyn does constantly, really lay into the Tories when in question time and, in the House of Commons, as do some of the others, John McDonnell and so on. So they try to be, as strong as they can, given the platforms that are available to them. And so we've just got to find ways of building the kind of more extra parliamentary power that is necessary.
Yes, I thought I was interested when you mentioned, Hayek's idea of tacit knowledge. Because both the Chinese government and, say, Jeff Bezos and Amazon both believe that they have the answer to Hayek's issue for the use of big data and surveillance technology. I was wondering how we've got this rise of the new authoritarianism, which is very willing to use the rise of the Internet of Things, to create databases of everything and anything. How do we, who believe in a sort of emancipatory partitional democracy, how do we answer that challenge in a way that wins, shall we say? Because at the moment, you see what's happened to the Uyghurs in China, and then you look at how Amazon treats its workers, and that, both using the exact same technology, often designed by the same people in Silicon Valley. Where's the sort of radical left's answer about for going on and saying, well, actually, let's just use big data anyway and try and go back to old-fashioned state planning?
Yeah, probably other people here can answer that, or we need a discussion about that. I don't know the answer. I'm sort of very interested in developments in the new technology around open software and the whole sort of, well, there have been attempts to develop alternatives to Facebook and sort of challenge the big data approach. So, I mean, I would sort of be getting advice and understanding from them. But I think also maybe it's important to distinguish data from knowledge. I mean, I don't think data is the same as knowledge, and tacit knowledge isn't the same as data. So having big data, I don't think is any sort of alternative to the tacit knowledge that can be mobilized by grassroots movements. So, you know, I can't just say grassroots movements are the answer. That's a bit of an incantation. But I do think that that in a way, organizing in a way that uses the internet but doesn't rely on the internet. So I think that's been important in countries like Spain, where they have used the internet to mobilize the indignados and so on. But at the same time, in places like Barcelona, they put a lot of stress on developing open software, new forms of I mean, in a way, treating the technology as not just a kind of linear development. You know, in a way, as the Lucas workers showed, technology can be designed and used in different ways, and there are choices to be made. So, in a way, the kind of political software engineers and IT workers are creating a new agenda for the whole development of not just big data, but of all the sorts of internet forms and ICT forms. And so I think we've got to kind of follow that approach, not be overwhelmed by them, but actually say, okay, here are some tools that we can use, but we've got to develop our own ways of sharing knowledge that are much more potentially empowering and retain control, you know, open up the sort of, you know, the codes and so on that lie behind Google and Facebook, and sort of not take their codes and their forms as unquestionable and as given. So the more skepticism there is about those corporations, the better. And I think, I mean, already Amazon workers are getting quite well organized. So working with people within those companies, I think, is crucial. But it's got to be a new front of struggle, the democratization of ICT itself.
I was very interested in a number of the points you raised, particularly about eugenics, because eugenics was also a very important idea for early social scientists like David Glass at LSE, not just the Webbs. So it really did have an enormous power as a conception, and could well come back again, I think, with new developments in biogenetics and designer babies and so on. I think it is a permanent threat. But I really wanted to just raise a point or two about tacit knowledge, because there's been some very interesting work by Donald Mackenzie at Edinburgh University with Graham Spinardi on tacit knowledge in the making of the nuclear bomb. And he showed that the original bomb in the Manhattan Project in America took a very long time to construct successfully. And indeed, when there was an attempt to replicate that, so we're talking about many years, I can't remember the exact number, but at least 7 years, there was an attempt to replicate that in China when they constructed their nuclear bomb, and it took 9 years to do it. And Mackenzie's argument is that when the bomb was replicated elsewhere in the West, there was use of tacit knowledge by the nuclear theorists about how both to develop it theoretically in terms of physics and practically in terms of the actual mechanics of splitting atoms. And his view was a rather optimistic one, that because tacit knowledge was so important, therefore, if we were actually to have a really significant ban on nuclear weapons, then a whole generation of nuclear physicists' knowledge, tacit knowledge, would disappear. And there would be a very real possibility that it would not be easy to reconstruct how to build a bomb again. So against the sort of view that this knowledge is now with us always, it's almost like original sin, his argument was that if you really had a significant binding first test ban treaty, then abolition of nuclear weapons altogether, you actually could destroy that tacit knowledge.
No, that's fascinating. And also it is another vindication of the importance of that governmental level, because a ban like that would require action by governments, so that in a way we can't rely on the tacit knowledge of the scientists to be the basis of of refusal. I mean, there will be some who refuse, but it's got to be a government action based on the feelings of the people that they want to end nuclear weapons. But that's really interesting. You don't remember the name of his book, or?
Well, it's an article by Donald Mackenzie and Spinardi that is included in one of Mackenzie's books.
Okay.
But you can also find it independently if you go to Google Scholar.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot.
So are there any final sort of questions or comments or? Oh, yeah, so,
I just got a question about how issues of environment and climate breakdown and these sorts of things seem to have split between left and right. Like climate issues and environment issues seem to have become a liberal issue, seem to become a left-wing issue in a lot of places, which is a real shame. I'd just like your opinions on how you think that has come to pass and what you can do to maybe bridge that divide and put it together.
Well, my own reaction to that, I mean, I suppose one reason why it's climate change and countering climate change is associated with the left is because the drivers of climate change have tended to be the kind of corporate market, the kind of unregulated market, and addressing climate change requires social regulation. In fact, you could say that climate change is one of the main arguments for socialism, contemporary arguments for socialism, for social control, for social regulation, for socializing the market. And so that would be my explanation of it. The right sees social regulation on environmental issues as a kind of encroachment on the freedom of the market and the freedom of private property, and also kind of erosion of profits, because it's increasing costs on companies, like say car companies or other kinds of energy carbon producing companies. I mean high carbon forms of production. I mean, how we overcome it, I mean, that division, I mean, I presume you mean how do we build a truly effective movement? I suppose means just, highlighting the common, problems facing humanity, that I mean, winning the argument about the need to socialize the market. In a way, maybe making it clear that doesn't mean the end of the market. There can be market mechanisms, but that they shouldn't dominate the economy. They shouldn't dominate life. They shouldn't be the kind of the most powerful economic considerations. There's got to be democratic control of the economy, within which there can be some market space, you know. I mean, I'm not against some market form, but it's got to be sort of socialised, it's got to be framed by social criteria and constraints, and the impact of production on the environment's got to be key, you know, maybe the dominant constraint and criteria. I don't know if that helps.
Great. Yes, I mean, again, I think this tacit knowledge and challenging particular given notions of what intelligence is and what knowledge is so important. And us lot in universities, we are hugely to blame for the failure to affirm other forms of intelligence, other forms of knowledge beyond the cognate. And, you know, I work down in theatre and teach through practice, and you begin to get this enormous sense that tacit knowledge is embodied as much as anything else.
Yeah.
It's in our bodies. When you get people to explain what they do, then they will use their bodies to explain that as well as they're talking. And I think we have a great responsibility in universities to start challenging the notion of particular forms of intelligence and excluding sensate intelligence.
No, I agree. It'd be interesting to talk more about how that can be done. And how, I mean, probably that means not just universities, but the whole education system. I mean, I don't know, it's a long discussion and I'm fairly ignorant on it, but I remember in sociology of knowledge, there was a guy called Basil Bernstein, who had this theory of, he was trying to understand the difference between, well, why working class people often didn't realise their full potential. And he was saying that it was because the forms of middle class sort of education and socialisation enabled middle class people to theorise and to sort of generalise, whereas the nature of working class socialisation and early education sort of restricted people's kind of conceptual framework to the particular, which, I don't know, I feel that does relate to the tacit knowledge versus sort of codified knowledge. And obviously there've been lots of reforms in education to do with comprehensive schools and so on, although that's going backwards now. But that somehow wasn't enough. That didn't solve the problem. So that points to the need for a re-evaluation of the kind of what's valued in education and what forms it should take. So, you know, there was a period maybe in the 60s, 70s where you know, other forms were valued, so more emphasis on freedom of expression, dance, theatre. So I think it's got to go back to the education system, and you know, even back to early years and you know, the very sort of nature of, you know, children's education. You know, I know a lot of people who are often quite reluctant to get their kid off to school early. I mean, early in their years, because I mean, these are mainly middle class parents who've been able to do a lot with their kids in terms of sort of self-education, taking them to places. You know, and there is a lot of good sort of child, often voluntary sector, sort of child provisions that enable parents and kids to sort of develop their tacit knowledge. But if that could be somehow valued by the education system and resourced properly and made as important as sort of learning your writing and arithmetic. So I don't know, I mean, it's a good point though, I think, you know, and then that would follow through to the universities.